Grace and peace to you from God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. I find today's gospel is very central to what we're going to see unfold in the Gospel of Mark this year. What exactly does this very brief teaching in the synagogue today, with Jesus' authority being recognized and even questioned, and what does the releasing of a man with an unclean spirit have to say to us today? Now, this passage, if I want you to recall, comes from the one that we heard last week, where Jesus called his first disciples. So we're at the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry in the Gospel of Mark. And the first thing that he does, we see, is that he goes into a synagogue on the Sabbath and starts to teach. So as far as Mark's gospel is concerned, teaching is vital to Jesus' ministry. But I find it interesting that nowhere in this passage does Mark address what Jesus taught. In fact, throughout the Gospel of Mark, if you look at it comparatively with the other Gospels, think of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Think about John and all of the poetic prose about lightness and darkness and death and life and good and evil. Mark, if you've ever gone to seminary, you'll realize that Mark is very blunt and to the point. His Greek is the simplest and most blunt. So for all of the other gospel writers, the content of Jesus' teaching is important. But today, Mark is trying to tell us something very different. By contrast, Mark seems to focus less on what Jesus taught, but on its power, its effect, the authority. The text tells us that everyone was astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not like the scribes. Well, those poor old scribes. Who were they? Well, they were people who did what they knew what to do. They interpreted the scriptures in the synagogue for people, going on precedent, that is, on what has been said in the past. They quoted tradition. They repeated what other people had said very faithfully. But unlike these scribes, Jesus somehow taught with authority. There was obviously something very different about how he spoke, how he carried himself, and how he conveyed his message. Now, a theory about this authority comes if you look up in your biblical commentary, which I know you all did before you got here. Some of those commentators believe that Jesus was actually an ordained rabbi. And so he would have had more knowledge and more conferred authority to speak. And that the people in Galilee were not used to having such a renowned rabbi come and speak to them. But we don't know if this is actually true. That's just a theory. Jesus' authority obviously arose from a source that was more significant than that. When he speaks with the authority of God. When Jesus teaches, he conveys through his gestures and his words. You know how like Lois does if she's telling you, you're going to do this, and He conveyed through his gestures and his words the very power and presence of God. He's not just imparting information. He's not just passing along something to be read in a book. He's not giving away secondhand ideas, however interesting those may be. No, when he stands before the synagogue that day, I like to think that he was lit up with God. He is inviting people not just to think about God, but to experience God. Jesus is a teacher who doesn't just want to put new ideas into our minds. He wants our minds to be transformed. He doesn't just want to fill us up with facts and figures to inundate our consciousness. He wants to enlarge our hearts, our very being. He wants to break us open so that we, too, can meet this God, this Father, from whom true authority comes. This God who makes all things new. Have you ever had a teacher or a leader who was like that in your life? Or might you be one? And the way of authoritative being, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but people who hold this kind of authority in their presence, in their words, they have a way of disrupting us. And being disrupted, I think, is a good thing because it calls for our attention. It intrigues us while at the same time scaring us. Admit it. And it's fair to say that Jesus does this in the synagogue with his power. And the interesting thing is that Mark is quick to say that this power, this authority, is actually healing. A power that sets free. Just then, says Mark, there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And the story tells of Jesus casting out this unclean spirit right then and there. And next week, we're going to hear about Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. And the next week, we're going to hear about him healing a leper. When did authority get linked to healing? You ever thought about that? What does that even look like for us? I'm still reminded of the meditation that we went through a couple of weeks ago, or last week, at the Congregational Enrichment Venture. Jesus sent them out, 70, 2 by 2. Don't take a bag. Don't take an extra pair of sandals. Don't talk to anybody in the road. Go into a house and speak peace. Eat what they put in front of you. And heal when there is sickness. Heal the people who come to you. He empowered his disciples, his apostles, to be sent, to heal, to speak peace. And yet we find that so incredible. Which one of you is thinking about going home today somewhere, somehow, and healing somebody? Who am I that God should give me the authority to speak or to heal? Who am I? Healing is what happens. It's pretty simple. Healing is what happens when we come into the presence of God in some way. The healing can take place very gently, as when a leper's skin is suddenly healed quietly and made whole. Or it may take place with a great struggle, as in the scene today in the synagogue, when the man cries out to Jesus and loudly rebukes him. The unclean spirit comes out, and the man was convulsing and crying. I don't know about you, but I can imagine this man's body tossing to and fro, convulsing. And it says to me that this spirit, which was attached to this man, had a firm hold. And maybe the man had a firm hold on that unclean spirit. And he had an inner battle in letting it go. Sometimes we don't want to let go of our unclean spirits, do we? After all, what is an unclean spirit? It's a spirit that stands in opposition to anything that is holy, good, that which is set apart. We're never told in our story what kind of unclean spirit this man had. But you and I do not have to assume that he was wildly crazy or that he was possessed by some strange demon, exorcist style. He might have just been an ordinary fellow like you and me, who was profoundly alienated from himself from others, and from God. His unclean spirit might have simply been a habit in his mind. And that habit led him to show up in the synagogue and to go through the routine, to go through the verbal formulas, to go through the soothing liturgies, and to think that those were enough in and of themselves. Ouch. I don't know about you, but that kind of strikes a little close to home. Maybe this fella liked conventional religion because it's predictable, it's safe. And maybe his spirit is only unclean because he has never ever experienced for himself the wild mystery of God. Because that wild mystery is always beyond our mental constructs. It is always beyond our images and ideas. And when Jesus enters this synagogue and starts to speak with authority, to speak with the very full power of God, this man shouts at him. He recognized who Jesus was. You are the Holy One of God. But he wants that guy to get out of there. Go back out there and take your authority out there. Go back to where you came from. Don't go bringing your living God right here into this sacred place where I've got everything figured out and all managed and under control. You remember Peter? After Jesus was died and raised and appeared to his disciples, they were out on the beach one morning and they'd been fishing all night. You know, Peter thought he knew it all about fishing. And Jesus told him to cast the net on the other side, maybe in deeper waters. And they rolled in a truckload of fish. And what does Peter say? He looks at Jesus and he says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." How often do we do that when we encounter the mystery, the love, the grace, the forgiveness, the holiness of our God? But you know, there's other kinds of unclean spirits that creep up on us. It's the kind that whispers in our ears, "You're not good enough. Try as hard as you might, but you're never going to amount to much. You're lazy. You're old. You're too young. You can't do that. Just give up." Oh, the mean things that those toxic voices say to us. They alienate us again from ourselves, from each other, and from God. They are deadly voices of shame and self-doubt. Is that the kind of unclean spirit that may be troubling some of us today? Or is it something else? Is it a spirit of fear? A spirit of anxiety? A spirit of worry? Because there's no shortage of that in our culture today. Maybe it's a spirit of bitterness. Maybe it's a resentment. Maybe it's a grudge that we just can't let go. Maybe it's a spirit that tempts you to be closed down. How insidious and tenacious those spirits can be. Genuine freedom, real authority, wholeness and healing can be frightening. And emotional wholeness can be the most frightening of all. It's a freedom sometimes that we don't even know what to do with. Upon hearing the voice of authority, a voice declaring our freedom, our unclean spirits immediately resist because they recognize the wild and mysterious God calling us to change. Change. You see, none of us, I think, wants to think about ourselves being possessed by an unclean spirit or in some way failing to hear the call of Jesus in our lives. But sadly, we've all got firsthand experience with sin. If you don't, I do. We sin, we miss the mark, and we're tempted to give up. Today, we are reminded that Epiphany, this season of Epiphany, is not just about longing for or acknowledging God's good deeds in the past, but acknowledging the greatness and the authority that resides within us right here and right now. It's about discovering with amazement all kinds of dreams, all kinds of possibilities from a God who is still very much on the move in our hearts and in our minds. If today you have heard his voice, harden not your hearts. God is calling. He's calling you. He's calling me. And he says, I love you. Come and see. Come and follow me. And here's your favorite part. The people of God said,